Hello from Rappel Cybersecurity. This is the third and the last part of the ISO 21434 training. Here we will go inside the standard and shed a light on different clauses and their contents. Duration of this part will be longer than part 1 and part 2. Some points to remind before we start. This presentation is not intended to be used for certification and compliance because these activities require a rigorous and multidimensional approach that cannot be presented in a simple video recording. The focus is on ISO SAE 21434. A dedicated presentation or UNR 155 will soon be available on my YouTube channel. This standard is not free, as you know. You need to purchase a license to have full access. Therefore, only a limited content is provided on the slides. Well, very limited though. We try to put references and links to all information that we present. Feel free to distribute or display this presentation as long as the content is not altered. And it's highly recommended to view part 1 and part 2 before this presentation. The table provided here is just an example to highlight certain cybersecurity roles in an organization. Many other roles can be introduced depending on your organization. Please pay attention to the cybersecurity manager, who is supposed to work with both project-dependent and independent teams. We will first make an introduction as usual and go into all clauses of the standard one by one. We will have questions for you at the end as well. We say literally a transition from J3061 to ISO SAE 21434 because J3061 is superseded by the standard. Hence, it should no longer be used. But let's see some history and the paradigm change. In 1994, the German DIN standard for safety of measurement and control equipment was released. DIN safety notion itself is much older, of course, but we highlight here the impact of the electronic equipment to safety. In 2002, when IEC 61508 was released, which is the generic standard on functional safety, the roots of the standard dated back to the previous DIN standard. However, 2002 is the date when it is officially recognized by European bodies. In 2011, the first version of ISO 26262 was released. It is the famous functional safety standard for road vehicles. In fact, it is the adaptation of the previous generic standard to road vehicles. It has stunning 12 volumes that explains possible hazards caused by malfunctioning behaviors of safety-related systems. These hazards must be correctly addressed to be compliant with the standard. Cybersecurity is mentioned in the last release as reference, but a direct mention does not exist. When SAE J3061 was released in 2016, it was meant to fill the cybersecurity gap in the automotive industry, and it did its job well. It's a comprehensive and detailed SAE text that addresses the technical, organizational, and management aspects. However, just 8 months after its release in 2016, ISO and SAE organizations made a collaboration to work on a new cybersecurity standard. The reason was to create a more formal one like ISO 26262, which was written in clear and precise requirements rather than recommendations and best practices. SAE J3061 is obsolete because it's superseded by the new standard, but its content is not. It's always a very good read. In fact, I find it very inspiring. As you might recall from the first part of this training, the final the final version of the ISO SAE 21434 was released in August 2021, and it follows the typical ISO format. It's organized in clear and well-summarized requirements. Certain information like technical solutions, cybersecurity controls, off-board equipment like chargers are omitted. In fact, it is more than the successor of SAE J3061, as it makes reference to several other standards, particularly ISO 31000 risk management. One shortfall of this standard is, even though it includes cybersecurity management system, it doesn't yet adapt the harmonized structure of ISO. That means the integration of this standard into an organization that already has other management systems running might not be straightforward. So, what's next? The answer is left to curious readers who follow the meeting minutes of ISO and the UNEC. We have talked about safety and cybersecurity a lot in the slide. Here comes a bonus question. What is the most important or impacting difference for you between safety and cybersecurity of an EE product? I repeat the question. What is the most important or impacting difference for you between safety and cybersecurity of an electronic product? My answer will come at the end of this presentation. Introduction. The main purpose of the standard is to address the cybersecurity perspective in EE engineering within road vehicles, putting the cybersecurity management at the center and throughout the whole life cycle of the product. In fact, this is the paradigm change that comes with the standard. The complete life cycle is susceptible to introduce vulnerabilities into the product. Therefore, cybersecurity measures are defined to take at each phase, and the required resources are ensured by the Cybersecurity Management System, the CSMS. The target of the standard is the family of road vehicles. As you might recall from the first part of the training, road vehicles is the name of the ISO Technical Committee TC22, and it covers motorcycles, cars, articulated goods vehicles, trucks, etc. The standard is applicable to all electronic systems developed or modified after the release of the standard. Well, this is a pretty broad scope, as a simple software change can also be considered as a modification. What is not in the scope? As you can see on the slide, ISO SAE 21434 doesn't prescribe any specific technology or technical solutions. That means it is the responsibility of the OEMs and the suppliers to develop their own solutions to mitigate cybersecurity risks. The standard doesn't allocate the functionalities to different items. That means the standard is written from the perspective of a single item, which can be the EE architecture or the set of cybersecurity cases of the cybersecurity relevant electronic units in the vehicle. The external systems like EV chargers might have a cybersecurity aspect, but they are not in the scope of the standard. However, you may see EV chargers in the market that have ISO certification. This is perfectly okay because ISO SAE 21434 sets the cybersecurity engineering requirements, and all companies are free to obtain a certification for their organization and products. Overview of clauses. First of all, I would like to highlight that order of the clauses in the standard don't necessarily prescribe an execution sequence except from 9 to 13. A brief description of clauses are presented in the slide. It's important to note that each clause has its own applicability. For example, Clause 6 describes the cybersecurity management system and is defined at organization level. It's applicable to all projects, so it is virtually project independent. Clause 8 describes the continuous activities in the project, like vulnerability analysis, that are performed at different levels. That's why it's applicable to all phases of the project lifecycle. Another example is clause 15 that describes the formal threat analysis and risk assessment methods. So this clause is also project independent. However, clause 9 is project dependent because it describes the create the cybersecurity concept of the project, which includes the TARA. I will not go into each clause, but please take time to have a look at this slide, as it is really important to understand the purpose and applicability of each clause in the ISO standard. That way, the cybersecurity activities that are required for compliance will be planned accurately and in perfect synchronization with project activities. Terms and definitions are very important in ISO standards, and ISO maintains a terminology database to ensure a common understanding. Therefore, this clause should be consulted to understand the terms before searching in web. For example, let's look up weakness in the link given. Five examples are provided that helps a lot to understand this term, as you can see here. Another example is the vulnerability. You may see here different definitions from different sources. However, they are telling the same thing. In fact, it is a weakness that can be exploited. Clause 4 General Considerations. This flowchart shows how item, its components, and other cybersecurity related terms are related to each other. Many levels are embedded in one image so that you can see their relations between them. It is very important to understand the item, where it is placed in the standard. As you see, the item sits at the top. It is the function level. For example, infotainment, engine, brake, ADAS, charging, and many other functions can be assigned to the item. The items are composed of sub-items which are generally, here you can see, software and hardware components. As you can see, components sit at architecture level, but this architecture should not be confounded with vehicle electronic architecture. In fact, it is the architecture of the item. The subcomponents are composed of software and hardware modules, you can see here, and these modules sit at implementation level. Now, pay attention to the typical V diagram from a SPICE which is placed onto the diagram. The clause 9, which is conception, and clause 11, which is the validation of the ISO 21434 standard, are applied at item level. Clause 10, which comprises development and testing, is applied at architecture and implementation levels. The testing, however, includes unit integration and other types of testing depending on the complexity of the architecture. We might come back to the slide from time to time to better understand the relationships and dependencies. Now let's progress. As mentioned in forward, ISO 21434 content cannot be shared to an audience who doesn't own a license. Therefore, format that is presented here will be used for all clauses. Please pay attention to the usage of the word extract, which is by definition not the equivalent of summary. Summary is an abstract or a condensed presentation, while extract is a part which is drawn out of something. So extract is just a part and never represent the whole. Clause 5. To enable cybersecurity engineering, the organization institutes and maintains cybersecurity governance and the cybersecurity culture, including cybersecurity awareness management, competence management, continuous improvement. This involves specifying organizational rules and processes that shall be independently audited. To support cybersecurity engineering, the organization implements management systems for cybersecurity, including managing tools and applying a quality management system. There are a certain number of activities that need to be executed in parallel to obtain compliance with the standard. A cybersecurity organization must be created first and sufficient resources be allocated for the team to start working. Then, updating the organization level documents like policies, processes, and rules should start in parallel with training of all employees in the organization hierarchy. Updating management systems or creating them from scratch is also necessary if they don't exist. Once the organization have sufficient confidence to have accomplished all tasks and have met all objectives, an independent audit should be performed. It is highly recommended to have an initial gap analysis to be able to interpret the results of the audit accurately. Clause 6. Project-dependent cybersecurity management includes activities that are mentioned in the sub-clauses on the right. These shall be executed for each project within the organization. However, reuse between similar projects is encouraged to save resources. Tailoring principles shall be defined and followed to ensure that what is planned at the beginning is correctly reported at the end of the project. Cybersecurity case, cybersecurity assessment, and release for post-development are performed at the late phases of the development and in post-development. It is strongly recommended to plan multiple instances of these activities to allow for corrective action and follow-up. Cybersecurity plan lies at the center of the activities, and it is explained in detail in the standard with several requirements. It is followed by the appropriate person or team in the cybersecurity project organization until the end of the project, and an assessment report is created based on the evidences gathered. The success of the cybersecurity project is dependent of the quality and the follow-up of the cybersecurity plan. It is highly recommended to assign an experienced cybersecurity compliance manager to this task who knows the ISO SAE 21434 standard and the UNR 155 regulation by heart. Clause 7. This clause applies if responsibilities for cybersecurity activities for an item or component are distributed. That means certain cybersecurity activities which are deemed necessary are performed by collaborative efforts between the OEM and its suppliers or between suppliers. It's remarkable that a dedicated clause is created in the standard. This shows how important it is to document and trace the cybersecurity activities in the whole supply chain. The distributed activities might be a big headache at the end of the project if an effective supplier follow-up is not done. The cybersecurity compliance manager should be in close communication with the project manager and hold dedicated meetings with the suppliers if necessary. It's not uncommon that cybersecurity topics are lost in routine project communications. On the right, you can see a flow chart from the OEM and down to different tiers. A written agreement, in other words, an interface agreement, must be signed between each stakeholder. In this figure, we need 5 interface agreements in total. Clause 8. Continuous cybersecurity activities are performed during all phases of the life cycle and can be done outside of a specific project. They start with monitoring and end with management of vulnerabilities that are identified. This is performed in a continuous fashion and is not interrupted by the project planning. The subclauses identify clearly what needs to be done in 4 steps. The details of each activity can be found in the standard, but let's briefly explain. Cybersecurity monitoring collects cybersecurity information and analyzes this information. Cybersecurity event evaluation determines if the cybersecurity event presents a weakness or not. Vulnerability analysis examines the weaknesses and assesses if a particular weakness can be exploited and might potentially be a threat to the system. Vulnerability management tracks the treatment of identified vulnerabilities throughout the life cycle of the affected products. The work products related to this clause are the evidences of the aforementioned activities. The diagram on the right provides a visual representation as well. Clause 9. Concept. This clause covers the cybersecurity conception of the item. Please rewind back to the slide on clause 4 to see what the item corresponds to. Cybersecurity conception of a particular project is a highly technical activity which is not described in the standard, as you might remember from the slide on scope. A formal process is described on how the conception should take place to guarantee that cybersecurity concept integrity is preserved from the definition of the item down to the cybersecurity requirements. This clause also includes the definition of the cybersecurity goals for the item, which might be considered as the top-level cybersecurity requirements. Refer to Clause 15, Risk Assessment and Threat Analysis, to learn more about how to formally create goals. In addition to goals, cybersecurity claims are also explained, which are the statements about the risks that justify a retention, transfer, or monitoring. In other words, goals are directly linked with high-level risks that must be reduced, but claims does not address the implementation of a cybersecurity measure to mitigate the risk. The work products of this clause are commonly covered in one TERA. However, this is not an obligation of the standard. A format is not mandated. A dedicated tool might be used for the TERA as well as an Excel worksheet. On the right, you might see the relation between clause 9 and clause 15. As previously stated, the formal derivation of the goals is explained in clause 15. Clause 10. This clause describes the specification of the cybersecurity requirements, architectural design, and verification activities at unit and at architecture level. Before we start to disclose, we should say that every project has its own characteristics and must be handled on its own. There is no solution that fits all projects. In addition, development of a product might be shared between several stakeholders, which again highlights the importance of Clause 7, the distributed activities. The main objectives of this clause are obtaining the good set of cybersecurity specifications at first, then developing the hardware and software architecture based on these specifications. Before proceeding to the implementation, we should ensure that cybersecurity specifications cover the cybersecurity concept which is developed in the previous clause, and there are no vulnerabilities at architecture level. Otherwise, it might be too costly to go back and modify the design. Once the architecture is okay, we go for the implementation and verification. ISO SAE 21434 provides a lot of flexibility to meet these objectives. The activities and their sequence of execution are described without mandating any specific tooling or method. However, examples are given to guide the readers, like the usage of coding rules for software or verification methods. A simple V diagram is also provided on the right. It doesn't differentiate between system, hardware, or software level development. It only reflects the order of the activities as written in the standard, simple as it can be. Clause 11. Do you feel tired? No. This clause describes the activities for cybersecurity validation, and it is performed against the cybersecurity goals and claims that are identified in the concept phase in Clause 9. Again, refer to the slide in Clause 4 to see the mapping between Clause 9 and Clause 11. Validation is done in the operational environment with the presence of other interacting systems. This can be on the vehicle, but also on a test bench with EE system architecture or an emulator. Validation must cover all goals and claims with the proper testing methods which should be previously identified in the validation plan. Validation is not considered as a part of the development phase in ISO SAE 21434. Therefore, the findings during the validation phase should be addressed carefully. The vulnerabilities which deem as high might be considered as a blocking point for the production. In this case, a deviation might be necessary depending on the project calendar if corrective action cannot be taken before the production. It is very unpleasant to discover vulnerabilities at this very late stage before production. Therefore, cybersecurity activities in concept and development phases should be executed with extreme care and no details should be missed. Close the valve. Production covers manufacturing and assembly of an item or component, including the vehicle level. A plan for production phase cybersecurity activities is created to ensure that cybersecurity requirements for post-development are applied to the item and vulnerabilities cannot be introduced during production. This plan is generally accompanied by checklists and facilitate the controls during production. Production lines might sometimes be based on a very remote location where no permanent cybersecurity positions exists. This might create certain gaps like production process not being aligned with security requirements or employees not being aware of cybersecurity processes. Therefore, it is vital to train all employees of the company to show that cybersecurity applies to all product lifecycle without exception and every employee must have the cybersecurity culture. A cybersecurity checklist example for production line is provided on the right to give an idea about the potential cybersecurity requirements for production and how they are verified. Attention, it's a very simple example and it should not be used as a real document. Clause 13. This clause describes cybersecurity incident response and updates applicable to items during serial life until the end of cybersecurity support. An organization normally has a vulnerability management system that takes actions whenever a new vulnerability arrives. During the serial life, when analysis of incidents revealed new vulnerabilities, these are taken care by the vulnerability management system as usual, and remediation actions are launched. However, since the item is installed in vehicles that are already in use, the updates require a different process than mentioned in change management. It is explained in this clause how the incident response in serial life should be handled by the organization and documented. You might refer to flowchart on the right to see certain steps. Please keep in mind that work products concerning updates are documented as work products of other clauses. Clause 14. An organization can end the cybersecurity support for an item according to the initial agreements, but that item can still be in service. However, decommissioning is the end of life of the item. It is scrapped and not used anymore. Therefore, the end of cybersecurity support and decommissioning are handled differently. An organization must inform its clients and sometimes the end users about the end of cybersecurity support according to a plan, because this will mean that the item might have vulnerabilities at that time that will not be managed anymore. It's like using an obsolete operating system which is no longer supported by its vendor. It might embody certain cybersecurity risks to continue using it, or some functionalities might get disabled to be able to keep it secure. Decommissioning of an item might not be under the control of the organization, therefore it is left out of scope of ISO SAE 21434. However, the cybersecurity assets of the item shall still be protected even when it is scrapped. Imagine a case where a vehicle becomes unusable due to an accident. The electronic units might be removed from the vehicle to be resold. In this case, personal information in these electronic units must not be recoverable even if a zeroizing procedure is not followed. And finally, clause 15. This clause describes a formal methodology to create the threat analysis and risk assessment, so-called TERA. It's a project level deliverable and each project must have its own TERA. However, similar projects might reuse up to a certain extent. As shown on the right, it should be delivered during the concept phase. If it's delayed and extended into development phase, costly works for unhandled cybersecurity risks might emerge. The main purpose of the TERA is to determine the extent to which a road user can be impacted by a threat scenario. This requires a formal and disciplined approach that is explained in this clause. Each subclause of this clause embody a TERA activity and a corresponding deliverable, which then collectively forms the TERA itself. TERA might be performed with basic office tools. However, it's recommended to use a dedicated tool for better visibility, reuse, and rework. There is a comprehensive example of TERA derivation in the annex of the standard for interested readers who own a license. That was the end of the presentation and also the end of the ISO 21434 training series. Now we have some questions to test yourself. Well, this time the questions are not that easy. My mood was a bit depressed while I was writing them. Firstly, my answer to the bonus question. I say my answer because there is always a better and more convincing answer to these types of questions, as you know. So the question was, what is the most important or impacting difference for you between safety and cybersecurity of an EE unit? My answer is, once the safety of an EE unit is achieved, it is expected to be safe till the end of life of that unit. However, cybersecurity compliance of that unit is under threat starting from the moment it leaves the production line. Even after the end of life, the EE unit must not leak any personal data. So now you can see the questions. There is one question for each clause. So please take your time to read them all. Well, they don't finish in the slides. And more challenging questions in the slide, which starts with clause 6 down to clause 15. Want to go further? You may book an appointment directly from our website to hear the answers to the questions directly from the author, who is me. It is completely free. If you want to learn more about our services, please subscribe to our social media platforms. We regularly update original content. And if your organization or your products need to be cybersecurity compliant and you are looking for unmatched consultation services, you are right on target. Please send us an email or book directly from our websites to get the consultation you want. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media platforms not to miss any updates. See you soon.